In my previous video, I stated that if the Ukrainians can't execute a counterattack in a very short notice against the Russian breakthrough, I suggest them to accept any kind of ceasefire terms in order to preserve their precious manpower. Well, right after I published that video, the Ukrainians commenced to execute certain countermeasures against the Russian salient, and later they launched proper counterattacks. But before we could go further, I would like to draw your attention to a new endeavor. With one of my ex-colleagues, Mr. Mate Borzo, we have started a new substack called The Officer's Outlook. Mate has valuable experience in the field of micro and macroeconomy, mainly in the defense industry. In our articles, we intend to focus on the trends of the defense industry and military economy by examining a phenomenon from both its purely warfighting and rather interesting economic point of view also. And since money makes the things work, I think you will find not just interesting but useful insights there. I put the link in the description and thank you if you check that out. In the title of this video I say that this counterattack means more and in the same time also less than it had achieved. In this video I will present you the operations themselves, and by this I hope that I can explain why I said that. If you think that my job worth it, please give this video a like and subscribe to my channel. If you find it interesting, please share it with your like-minded friends. If you are convinced that I am a clone of either side's propaganda, please don't hesitate to write it down in the comments. However, before we could go further, please allow me a disclaimer. I could rely on only scarcely available open sources while making this video. A large part of this analysis will be based on deductions based on these open sources and the fundamentals of tactical level land forces warfighting. And now, let's begin. In situations like this Russian operational level breakthrough, it is essential for the defender to assess the situation first. I mean, the defensive lines are broken, reinforcements are hastily rushed to the scene, and the operational level HQs can rely only on scarcely available reports. To regain an up-to-date situational awareness is of the utmost importance. There are some ways to do so. First of all, the adjacent units to the breakthrough must reconnoiter their immediate areas of influence. In this situation, the 120th Territorial Defense Brigade and the Corps ex-Police Brigade were the closest one. These units supposedly received the task to reconnoiter the entry side of the salient in order to have a clear picture on the Russian reinforcements and logistics arriving into the salient through the choke points of the Kazany-Torets River. More important task is to prevent the attacker to widen the breakthrough. Of course, first and foremost the adjacent units must pivot their direction of defense in order to cover their open flanks. But in this situation these units were already overstretched, therefore reinforcements were needed. We have information that forward elements of the 92nd Assault Brigade had already arrived on the 12th of August, and the brigade was present with its full force by no later than the 13th. Their main task was to cover the approaches of Dabropelia. Also, the 79th Air Assault Brigade had been dispatched to this area. This unit had been removed from the front line after the Kodron Battle of Ulakli, and now they have been deployed to this critical area, but I assume they were far from the ideal strengths and level of training. At the eastern flank of the salient, the aforementioned Corps Police Infantry Brigade and some subunits dispatched from the fresh 157th Mechanized Infantry Brigade tried to prevent the Russians from widening the breakthrough. But in a situation like this, the most important and the most difficult task is to try to find how deep the enemy penetrated. In order to do so, the defender must reconnoiter the forward elements of the attacker and try to stop the advancing enemy by sending troops to hold vital junctions and other tactically important areas here. This is a difficult task because the defender must send its forces into the unknown. In this case, the disrupted and severely defeated units of the 1st Da Vinci Wolves Assault Regiment and the 4th Rubish Police Infantry Brigades were unable to fulfill this task. It resulted that the gray zone was particularly blurry for the Ukrainians, therefore the incoming reinforcements of the 82nd Air Assault Brigade and the 12th Azov Brigade had to act swiftly but in the same time very carefully. According to open sources, this was the approximate position of the Ukrainian forces by the end of the 13th of August. In order to provide adequate information to the commanders and staffs, the Ukrainians had to launch dozens of recon drones and recombined force missions executed with UGVs, unmanned ground vehicles, and of course with dismounted infantry small units. According to my deduction, based on the timing of the events, some of these missions were executed on the 11th, mainly at the flanks of the salient, and the bulk of these tasks had been executed on the 12th at the tip of the salient. At the end of the 13th of August, based on later published not-so-trustworthy casualty figures, on the available combat footage, on Russian field manuals, and the natural law of the tactical level warfighting, the following Russian units were present in the salient. There were at least two, but rather three dismounted reconnaissance groups in Mariivka and Novovodyane, and in the tree lines between the two villages. I am pretty sure that there was an infantry platoon in the defense northwest of Rubizhne in the forested area, and another one holding the forested hill south of Novotroitsk, overlooking the TO 514 highway and covering the left flank of Vesele. It is also logical, deducting from the ensuing tactical engagements, that there was at least one infantry platoon in Hruska and Vesele, and another one in Rubizhne itself. And based on available drone footage, the company HQ with some drone units was present in Zaloty Kalodyaz. This beefed-up company-sized element was holding the salient north of this sector boundary. Their southern neighbor was at least another company with some combat support elements and maybe a forward command post of the battalion. But considering the reality of today's warfare, I assume that only infantry and drone units were here, and the battalion's forward command post was east of the Kazany Torets River. What is more important, that it is more than possible that there was an infantry platoon in Kuchery Yar, another one, or rather two, holding the lines facing Dobropilya, and at least a company worth of forces was necessary to keep open the salient between Shahove and Nove Shahove. So I would say that the Russians had approximately a battalion worth of forces in the salient with some subunit level drone units, but the meaningful artillery and drone support was available only from outside of the salient. So this was the situational picture that could be provided to the Ukrainian commanders and staff officers, at least based on my deductions. The next question is what to do, how to execute the counterattack. In the good old days, the heavy cavalry would launch a destructive onslaught and would crush the hordes of orcs with a whirlwind-like assault. Oh, I mean that before 2022, it was obvious that after heavy artillery preparations, the Ukrainians would deploy armored and mechanized infantry battalion battle groups and crush the Russian salient at its neck while fixing the Russians at the tip of the salient with supporting attacks. But of course, nowadays, if the Ukrainians would have tried to concentrate these forces, the Russians would prematurely destroy them with drones and artillery. So the old-fashioned solution was out of question. The second option was the Russian-style course of action. I mean, containing the salient and recapture it by long months of fighting with constant, coordinated assaults of infantry small units. It was also out of question. First of all, because the Ukrainians didn't have the means to do so. Secondly, the Ukrainians didn't have the time for this slow process, because the Russians would have heavily fortified their positions in the coming weeks. Therefore, the third option was the mix of bold action, a dispersed deployment of forces, and the employment of the latest technological advancements. The Ukrainians had to deploy modern sensors and canalize the information gathered by them into the staff's decision-making processes. They had to send well-trained infantry subunits with quite significant UAV and UGV support to execute recombined force missions to have perfectly accurate overview of the Russian situation. And subsequently, the Ukrainians had to launch swift, well-supported company-sized attacks with heavy drone and artillery support. These attacks don't have to be armored, hence the distances to cover with these attacks were less than 4 kilometers in each direction. But in order to ensure the necessary superiority, a slight numerical advantage and overwhelming fire support is a must. After all of this, let's see what had happened. On the 13th of August, the Ukrainians commenced their counteroffensive with the aforementioned recombined force tasks all along the front line, but mainly north of Kuchery Yar. In the area of operations of the 93rd Mechanized Infantry Brigade, there was an interesting event. One of these tasks had been executed by an unmanned ground vehicle. It was a small, tracked vehicle with a PKT machine gun mounted on top of it. Here is a picture of a weapon like this that I made at the Defense Industry Expo. It is a bit different, mainly considering it is equipped with an NSVT heavy machine gun, but it is built by the same fundamentals. By the end of the day, the Ukrainians managed to push back the Russians to the TO-514 highway, but what is more important that the Ukrainian commanders and staffs had a perfectly updated operational picture of the salient. It was time to launch the main attack against the salient because the Russians were constantly sending reinforcements into it. The Ukrainians launched the main attack on the next day, but they chose a surprising concept of operation. Instead of launching the main attacks into the anticipated directions, they chose another scheme of maneuver. They launched very small subunit level attacks against the neck of the salient as shaping operations. The main attack of the main operations, however, had been launched against the tip of the salient. Forces of the 12th Azov Brigade, the 79th Air Assault Brigade, and the 93rd Mechanized Infantry Brigade launched coordinated company-sized assaults. As far as we know, the 93rd assaulted and retook Ruske and Vesele. Elements of the 79th Air Assault Brigade recaptured Rubizhnya and the forested area northwest of it. And while these operations were the anvil, the 12th Azov Brigade's coordinated attacks were the hammer via which they recaptured the salient, and by the end of the 14th of August, they liberated the tactically important village of Zaloty Kolodjaz. But this was only the first phase of the Ukrainian decisive operation. With this first phase, the Ukrainians surprised the Russians by choosing a different concept of operations and launching the main attack against the tip of the salient. But the Ukrainians pulled another trick and swiftly shifted their main attack against the neck of the salient. It was the situation by the early afternoon of the 14th of August. The Russian salient had been reduced to its half. However, the Azov and the 79th had a large part of their forces tied down, mopping up the Russian subunits tenaciously holding out even after the main attack had bypassed them. So it was another reason for shifting the center of gravity of the attack. The initial main effort had their hands full. The other reason was that the Russians now anticipated that this is the Ukrainian Konop, hence it really was. Therefore, the Russians tried to send reinforcements into the salient, but what is more important, they reconcentrated their fire support efforts towards the tip of the salient and near Poltavka, of which I will talk about a bit later. Early afternoon, while the mopping up operations were ongoing north of Zaloty Kolodjaz, the 92nd Mechanized Infantry Brigade and the 82nd Air Assault Brigade launched a coordinated attack. Company-sized elements of the 92nd defeated the Russians in the forested area, while the 82nd defeated the platoon battle positions at the eastern flank. After these tactical victories, they pushed on and cut the salient in two. Meanwhile, the Russians, of course, did not just sit and wait. As I said, they tried to send reinforcements into the salient, but most of them were hit by Ukrainian drones and artillery. These letters were helped by the fact that the Russians could transfer anything to the salient only via choke points over the Kazany Torets River. But what is more important, that the Russians also tried to regain the initiative by shifting their center of gravity at the operational level. The 150th Guards Motorized Rifle Division received an order from the superior 51st Combined Arms Army to help the 132nd Motorized Rifle Brigade with a supporting attack. This order had been issued presumably on the 12th, so it means that the Russians also had a very good overview of the situation. On the 13th, the 102nd Motorized Rifle Regiment of the 150th Guards Motorized Rifle Division launched small shaping attacks towards Poltavka, and on the 14th they captured it with an attack of a whole company. On the 15th, the Russians tried to shift their center of gravity again and attacked on Vladimirivka, but this attack had been beaten back by the combined effort of the Court Police Brigade and the 82nd Air Assault Brigade. Interestingly, the Russians couldn't do any more. The Ukrainians seemingly enjoyed numerical, drone and artillery superiority in the salient and its immediate proximity. The sources from these days are even more scarce. What we know is that on the 15th and the 16th of August, mopping up operations were ongoing in the marked sectors. And we also know that the salient had not been fully cleared of the Russian infantry fighting tenaciously by the 17th, because we have information that drones of the 157th Mechanized Infantry Brigade were attacking Russian infantry in Kucherev Yar. This fact that the drone units carrying out a strike this far from their standard area of operations also has some interesting information in itself. At the data cutoff day of this video, which is the 27th of August, I can state that the Ukrainians mobbed up the Russian salient and pushed them back to approximately this blue line. Some Ukrainian units participating in the counterattack has already been redeployed. For example, the 79th Air Assault Brigade is reportedly launched some small-scale counterattacks near Nova Ekonomicha, some 20 kilometers south from here. The Russians consolidated their lines, and I assume that they will commence the preparatory phase of another, yet the fourth attempt to take Pokrovsk. But what have we learned from all of this? First of all, the Russian breakthrough should not have happened at all if the Ukrainians would have been able to organize the defense here at an adequate level back in the first days of August. Secondly, this Russian breakthrough should not have been looked like this if the Russians realized that their initial success was larger than they anticipated, and it eventually led to their demise. As I stated at the beginning of this video, this counterattack was a huge test of the AFU, which they passed with high scores. In order to achieve a success like this, they had to create the favorable balance of forces ratio, which was approximately 4-1 in their favor at the beginning of the main attack. This is the commanders and staff's main job: to correctly anticipate the time and location of the decisive engagement and to gather adequate forces to obtain the necessary superiority. In this regard, the Ukrainians performed outstandingly. But it is easier said than done. The Ukrainian commanders and staff officers had to maintain and constantly update an accurate situational awareness, for some units in the process of redeployment. To do so, nowadays the Ukrainians have the adequate asset, the so-called Delta Battlefield Information Management System. But this system works properly only if the data loaded in the system is correct and they are assessed correctly by professional staff officers. What I want to say is that the Ukrainians presented brilliant operational level leadership and decision-making processes before and during the operation. In order to do so, the AFU had to behave here like a professional armed force would do. And they succeeded. I mean that to achieve all of the above mentioned, they had to coordinate 5 brigades initially dozens of kilometers from each other. They had to plan and organize the counterattack in less than 48 hours and subsequently had to lead the units during the operations. It means that they had to have a functioning army corps here. In one of my previous videos, where I described the Russian operations in the southeastern corner, I found that the Ukrainians there may acted like an ad hoc army corps, but here they really had one. According to open sources, the first corps of the Ukrainian National Guard, the Azov Army Corps, was the responsible for the operations. And this army corps proved that they have one of, if not the best functioning military staff in the world. Too bad that the AFU is currently unable to act like this all along the front line. The units executing this operation were elite, both in terms of training and leadership. I mean, there are approximately another dozen units like this, but that is all. I really hope that this level of leadership and staff officers' proficiency will soon be widespread in the AFU, because this can truly be a wonder weapon. But all in all, I am sad to say that I think that all of this was much ado about nothing. The front line is largely back where it was a month ago, but thousands of lives had been lost in the process. The attritional warfare is continuously going on. The AFU fights heroically. They prove that their best units are one of, if not the best fighting forces on Earth. The Russian summer offensive is failed to achieve their main operational goals. Pokrovsk, Siversk, Liman, and Kupiansk are still in Ukrainian hands, albeit the crisis is huge near Kupiansk. But until the Russians are suffering relatively smaller casualties, compared to their overall manpower pool. This balance of attrition will be in the Russians' favor. Well, that is all that I wanted to say for now. If you think my job worth it, please give this video a like or subscribe to my channel. If you have anything to add, I am really more than happy to see into the comments. I try to reply, as you may see. Thank you and see you soon.